So allow me to introduce our moderator for the panel, Danielle Maldonado, Senior Product Manager at Realtor.com. And a very interesting fact, she was once ranked 91st in women's saber, so be careful. All right, Daniela.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, audio's on. Great. So joining me for our panel this afternoon is Cassidy Fine, Director of Product at Vimeo. Cassidy, go ahead. Oh, yes.
Hi.
Wherever you want to take a seat.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, nice to meet you.
Jal Tamala, Senior Director of Product at HelloFresh.
It's actually not GM,
And Analika Venkatram, Senior Product Manager at Stash. And now I'm going to see half the room, but I'll assume you can all hear my voice. And I'm so excited to, just as Jeremy was saying, we've learned so much today about different opportunities and areas and frameworks and just methods, a lot to apply, right? So very excited to talk with our product leaders this afternoon around how they identify areas for impact within their organizations, how they define impact in their organizations for their user base, and the wonderful job of aligning those priorities with the areas of impact that they see. So moving right along, Cassidy, would love to start with you. The ideas of defining impact for your organization, for your product, and then how you go about identifying impactful areas with those definitions.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so probably everyone will groan when I say this, but impact is obviously how you measure up against your North Star, your OKRs, whatever you are measuring against. So effectively, you can only be impactful if you have a solid understanding of what those are, or setting those and revisiting those, frequently, whether that's through kind of a weekly Foursquare model or any other sort of quarterly review. If you are not measuring your impact in any sort of useful way other than shipping, then how do you have any idea how you're being impactful, right? In terms of kind of how you ensure, is your question how you ensure your orgs are kind of consistently impactful, or?
Identifying areas that for impact in your organization.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, I think we really look at first kind of understanding areas of the product maybe that are more mature or less mature and how they sit in the market. That will kind of tend to help inform us where we have opportunities to grow even further, where maybe our North Star KRs are reasonable or shorter term versus maybe longer term, or pushing that boundary of unreasonable, which is always a fun, interesting place to be in. I think again, understanding competitive landscape, your market, the maturity of your product, and the typical sorts of consumers and sales cycles that are around that product. And again, finally, just tying it all back to your OKRs, understanding what you're measuring against or what you're measuring next. With all that, I think that balance of health metrics will also help you understand, are you potentially cannibalizing other areas of the product that could be hindering that success or that impact. So, of course, you don't want to succeed in one area, take one step forward and two steps back elsewhere.
Yes, that's absolutely a thought we can come back to, as pertains to our different products, right? Jal, what about you? How do you define impact for your product, for your organization?
Yeah, so I would think from two perspectives, right? Like when we are developing a product that directly has customer impact, I think we would measure our customer experience impact. We would measure it from a business KPI perspective, right? Whether it's your conversion rates or your net revenue, or any sort of North Star metric and business KPIs that you define. Where it becomes difficult is if you're building tools for end users in your organization, who then use your tools to create those customer experiences, right? So you as a team and as a product owner don't necessarily directly control the customer experience, but you are actually enabling tools that will then go, create those customer experiences. That is where it becomes difficult to define impact, but we need to try hard, right? Like you might not be able to measure it directly by, okay, how much revenue I'm generating or how many new customers I'm bringing in, but maybe it could be like, am I enabling my end users to shorten their business process, right? Or am I, if you're building an experimentation platform, am I actually enabling my end users to launch 50% more experiments in a given quarter? So I think that's where, when you're building tools that are not directly CX, customer experience oriented, we need to try very hard to define impact, but it's important.
Yeah, no, that's and so much powers any one of our organizations, right? We often think of the customer-facing products, but ultimately there's a business behind the business in every business, right?
Yeah.
With that in mind, identifying impact in those cases kind of takes alignment, a word we've heard a lot today, and takes kind of internal discovery as well, right?
It does, absolutely. I think there's a lot of stakeholder alignment, stakeholder management that goes with building an internal tool, right? It's important to actually, while you're building the tool, at least work with one of the stakeholder groups that are actually going to use that tool in the end state, right? Like, you shouldn't take an approach of build it and they would come, right? So if we do that, I think we are setting up for failure. But even if you're building a tool, I would say build with at least one of your end user groups, so that they are, while you're building the tool, they're also parallelly using it and giving you feedback.
Great. Annalika, what about you?
In terms of what impact means?
Defining impact for your organization, how you identify those areas for opportunities.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of impact, I work at Stash, and for us, everything is related to the mission. We had amazing speakers today that talked about mission and vision, and for us at Stash, everything we do is related to our mission of empowering our customers, everyday Americans, to build long-term wealth and achieve their financial goals. So yeah, it's really important for us to understand who our customer is, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who the end customer is. And at Stash, everything we do is really keeps in mind our end customer. So if we illustrate who our end customer is, so imagine, so our customers are over 5 million Americans, and they each have a unique financial background with an average household income of about $50K. And these customers of ours, on average, are depositing around $31 at a time. And if you think about that, over time, as a collective, our customers have saved over $3 billion, and that's huge. Just think about the impact of $31 exploding into that kind of large growth. And when you think about investing in general, there's this myth that you need to have a lot of money in order to get started. But at Stash, what we tell our customers is that it's really easy to get started with just $5. And so for us, impact is really helping our customers achieve that vision of long-term wealth and putting them in a position where they can achieve their financial goals. So everything we do is related to that North Star.
Wonderful. So kind of moving on a little bit here, we talked a lot about frameworks today, heard a variety of acronyms on our slides today. I'm sure everyone here is curious to hear what frameworks you use, what you apply, what you don't apply in your respective roles. Joel, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are a ton of frameworks if we want to pick right, but at least my philosophy is keep it simple. Right? My most favorite framework is actually a 2x2, right? Value and effort. Right? That it just visually communicates so well with business stakeholders, your business leaders in the organization. And sometimes I use the impact, confidence, and effort metrics, right? But I think my biggest takeaway in using the frameworks over the years is do not apply frameworks just purely as your prioritization methodology, right? Because it's as much science as it is art, right? Like just because you have applied a framework and you have a rank list of features to build, you should just go and build it in that way. I think there's a lot that goes into in terms of like a risk and dependencies, that all everything that you need to take into consideration, right? So I think I would say pick a simple framework that works for your context, but then also like revalidate the outputs of that framework, prioritization framework, with your teams and your stakeholders.
What about yourself?
Yeah, so in my spare time, I also teach for Mind the Product, and I always have to kind of warn folks that there is no silver bullet for prioritization. It's not like a thing you feed in data and it spits out, a list of stuff. And you're like, great, I'm going to go do the stuff, and then I win a PM. That's it. That's all I have to do. I think we actually talked about this before, where basically you really have to be careful about being overly reliant on one particular framework or one particular tool. I think a kind of good PM has a kind of handful of those frameworks in their back pocket ready to kind of use or try out, depending on, I look at either the source of data, so whether it's internal or external, whether that's from users or from folks internally, stakeholders. If you're in internal products, obviously your users are also sometimes your stakeholders, so that's equally kind of interesting and complex. Combined with kind of the type of data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And keep in mind, large amounts of qualitative data can also then turn into quantitative data. So, with that, I'll try to balance, something from like a Kano model to kind of something more maybe quantitative, like a, user, I think it's called a user story rank or user story journey. Jeff Golth invented it. Yes. So I'll try to kind of keep a balance of things, but ultimately, any framework you use should get you to an outcome that you and your team are more confident in faster than not using one. And if that's not the case, you should try a different framework.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? You should feel free to try new things, see if they work for your organization, but ultimately also be able to reflect, retrospect, and identify when a better option still exists, right?
Yeah.
What about yourself?
Yeah, so I've definitely used frameworks in the past, and I'll say this, prioritization is more of an art than a science, in that there is no one-size-fits-all framework for your situation. What you use might depend on the company you're in, industry, product, sometimes even the same product, depending on what stage it's in, you might use different frameworks. And the other thing to note is that frameworks have limitations. I mean, we all see when you do research on frameworks, they have this formula that you seemingly can plug and play into, but when you start doing the research and digging into it, you'll notice that it's not as scientific as you might think. And so it's important to understand that they have their limitations. And since this panel is about impact and in prioritization in particular, some of the frameworks define impact differently. Some might focus impact on customer impact only and not necessarily take into account business impact. And if you only prioritize the customer impact, you're missing out on something from the equation, because what drives customer impact might not necessarily drive business impact. And so it's really important to fit the framework you use for their particular situation and understand that there are limitations you need to be aware of.
So as a follow-up, and to all of you, but I'll start with your response. You've identified areas for impact, synergies, growth. You're in, whether that's a quarterly planning, annual planning process. Who do you go to? Who are you listening to as you kind of work through those priorities? Are you talking to stakeholders? Are you talking to your customers? Are you leaning on other leaders in the company?
It really depends on the situation. I mean, obviously, you'll always want to be thinking about the customer, but that's just one part of the equation. It's absolutely critical. You need to know who the customer is, what problems you're looking to solve, but you also need to weigh it against other considerations. So you want to weigh it against company priorities. You want to weigh it against any timeline constraints. What are other competitors doing? Do you need to catch up? Are there things related to, are there resource constraints? Are there regulations you need to keep up with? There's just so many angles of things that you need to consider. That it's important to know that who you listen to depends on the situation you're in. And as a PM, you have to make trade-offs constantly. I think in one of the earlier sessions today, there was a chess analogy that was brought up, and I'll kind of pull it forward in that being a product manager is like playing chess. Sometimes you need to give, sometimes you need to take, sometimes you need to negotiate. And who you listen to, who you negotiate with at a given time really depends on the situation at hand.
Over to you.
So I think I agree with all of that. I think one additional point I would say is, don't just listen to the loudest person in the room, right? I mean, we kind of get biased by the loudest voice in the room. I think especially if you are trying to do user research or like stakeholder interactions and collect ideas and priorities, I think it's important to actually take a diverse set of inputs into consideration, right? If somebody is just asking for something, doesn't mean you need to do it, right? It's what we are not doing is as important as what we are doing.
That's fair. Cassidy.
I think y'all kind of covered all the good bases. I think just to say this also, by getting to prioritization, we've assumed that we've already done most of the hard work that really encompasses a lot of PM, right? I think there's a lot of focus, I know, in kind of talks I listen to and kind of chatter online on prioritization, because in some ways I think it's more of the fun part of PM. Like, you are the decider, you are kind of making decisions and how we move forward and kind of what that looks like, and it's the last concrete step aside from forming your roadmap, which is effectively a tool that socializes and shares out and memorializes your prioritization before you start building. And I just think it's important to be mindful of how much work you should have put in to get to the prioritization step around research, around validation, around hypothesis generation, around stakeholder alignment, understanding who your stakeholders actually are, discovery, all that good stuff.
Yeah, right. It should really be a culmination of all those phases before getting to the actual execution of work, right? In prioritizing and in sharing out our priorities after that's done, we're socializing with stakeholders, we're socializing with teams, we're socializing with dependencies. In that, I kind of want to reflect on this the Slido question here. Maybe not so much as like an explicit answer of what to do, but rather that if those objectives and key results exist in your organization, set by engineering managers, if they have product folks such as yourself in that organization, then certainly there should be other product leaders that are part of defining those objectives, right? I want to briefly respond and then kind of open the question up to you all. Articulating the business or customer value that those objectives could drive would be one way to kind of reclaim ownership, redefine, add color to, add flavor to, in a way that you can get excited about it. If you don't have a way to really impact the objectives and key results themselves. But in doing that, I imagine you might spark up thoughts in other managers, leaders in the company, and if people get a taste of, okay, now I understand what this objective actually meant and what it's meant to drive. Before you know it, that could become, the expected format, right? Does anyone else want to provide some light there?
So one thing I would say, I think, just maybe a slightly tangential response to the question is, like a lot of people refer to product strategy and technical strategy. I would say they don't exist actually in silos, right? Like your technical strategy is a part of your product strategy, right? So if we are in a situation where a lot of your OKRs are technical in nature and sounding technical in nature, I think, definitely as a product owner, you have to partner with your engineering, manager to, build maybe a better set of OKRs, right? The other is finding proxy metrics, right? Like, if you are making improvements on technical aspects of your product, how is that going to have an impact on the business KPI? So like just at least having that, some proxy metrics that can translate into improvements in business. Right? So I think both of those would help.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first, 20 OKRs is way too many. It sounds like maybe they're health metrics and KPIs and OKRs and maybe a mishmash of things, I don't know. Or maybe you're a PM within a very technical product, maybe you're a platform product manager. But ultimately, by definition of objectives and key results, it should be something that you yourself have the ability to impact, whether it's positive or negative. And your KR is a measurement of whether you're meeting your objective or not, and that is separate from things like KPIs or health metrics or SLA, requirements or anything else like that. So it sounds like it could be worthwhile to kind of have a conversation with this manager and say, here are some other ideas I have. I believe as a PM, these are things I can actually impact while we also monitor these KPIs or other health metrics. I also tell people where they feel like they're in a position where they don't have the influence or power to kind of set their OKRs. I welcome them to kind of set their own as well. That may seem a little chaotic, but it also it helps them at least measure against something that they feel that they can be impactful on, which I think is usually helpful. But 20 is too many. I'm sorry, whoever said this. Yeah.
I hope that what's happened is that there's a lot of KRs within those objectives, and this is just like enumerating all those things. That's my hope. But on kind of like segueing from here onto the topic of strategy, OKRs for those of you that don't use OKRs in your companies, sometimes you set them. Hopefully, you set them at the annual basis, but certainly that can be applied differently. And looking at things just a year out that's just one time horizon, right? Oftentimes we have to take a step back, as I think it was Dennis earlier today saying, we need to take time to just stare at the wall and think, right? And hopefully we're thinking about more than just the next year. We're thinking about what the next 2 to 3 years look like, what 5 years looks like, what technology will exist in 10 years, and all those fun thoughts. So in the context of identifying areas for impact, and then prioritizing those in your work, ultimately I'm sure you come across areas that will pay off in the long term, but ultimately you do also have those short-term objectives, OKRs or otherwise, to kind of balance, right? How, yes, and I'm expecting a one-word answer. How do you balance those? Go. No. Annaleka, would you like to start?
Sure. I think before you even get into balancing them, you need to be able to identify what your short-term and long-term priorities are. So what's really lucky, where I am at, Stash has an annual planning process, and during that time, the entire company gets aligned on what we call our big rocks. And so these are projects that are large in scope and investment, and that gives everyone in the company an idea of what our longer term priorities are that we want to shoot for. But then, if we only worked on long term goals, then that would be easy, but we also have to worry about our short term and medium term. And the way I think about categorizing them, I have this simple checklist in my head in terms of how I think about it. And so something is a short term goal or priority if it is a one-off. It's something that needs to be tackled immediately. So it could be a critical bug that you have to fix because it's impacting the customer experience. And so that's something that you need to handle in the short term because that has an impact on things like retention and engagement. And then, if you think about medium-term priorities, for medium term, I think about them as enhancements that you could release into the market. So it could be a new feature, it could be an enhancement on an existing feature. Sometimes, previously I worked in the media space, so medium-term priorities could also be releasing features so you could comply with upcoming regulation. And so for longer term, I think about things that would allow us to scale. So longer term would be getting into alignment with big rock projects maybe looking at platform improvements that can impact multiple teams and really allow you to scale. And my favorite, tech debt. So doing our best to reduce tech debt because that really allows you to scale as you grow your product. And so that's how I think about at least identifying the different kinds of priorities and goals and how I think about categorizing them.
So that was identifying.
That was identifying.
And at the point of trade-off, balancing, prioritizing one over the other, what are some methods you lean on?
Yeah, so in terms of methodology, we've talked about frameworks, and what I've leaned into in the past is I created my own lightweight framework where if something came up, I prioritized it and created a ranked score. I assessed it based on customer impact, business impact, confidence, and effort. So I created this kind of arbitrary rank score to help me assess if I needed to prioritize one thing over the other. So if it was a critical bug that needed to be addressed, so I drop everything now and work on it. And sometimes, it's really hard, and this is just an arbitrary way of doing it. There's no right way to balance your long-term and short-term priorities. We try to give ourselves a quantitative way of showing why we're doing what we're doing, because it's important when you prioritize that you also communicate it with your stakeholders on why you're doing things in a certain way. And so there's no right way to do it, but that's one way I've approached it in the past.
I mean, as you touched on tech debt as something, to kind of balance in there too. And, in my view, that's kind of a long-term investment, right? Because a reliable, maintainable service, product, et cetera, ultimately, has different payoff, right?
Right.
So I think it's a problem that we all deal with, right? That balancing of, I know this is going to pay off later, but I have these other shiny or more important or more critical things to work on now.
Yeah, and there is a story I can share related to that. Yeah. So in my previous job, I worked at ALM Media, where my focus was on the B2B subscription experience for law firms and legal departments. Super interesting stuff, for sure. And I worked on this R&D project called Law.com Radar. And when we first launched this, it was something we had a hypothesis. We prioritized speed to get it to market. And once it was launched, we were surprised at the reception we got from the market, and so more and more people started using the product, and that's when we realized, we didn't think about certain things. So this product, what we did was Twitter for lawyers. It was a customizable news feed. They could use that to feel smarter about themselves when they talk to clients and get news that they needed about their area of practice. And so, here's this news feed they're on. It's customizable, but as you add more and more audiences to use the product, you suddenly get into performance issues. We didn't think about things like, what happens if there was too much content loading on the feed? What happens if the app crashes? So there were performance issues that started to come into play as we added more and more audiences to the app. And at that point, on my short-term roadmap, I definitely had these features I wanted to prioritize because it would increase engagement and retention, hopefully. But with the performance issues that were happening, it made me realize, we need to prioritize tech debt, because if we don't refactor this, then the performance issues will continue, and instead of sticking with the product, people are going to abandon because they don't want to wait 20 seconds for their content to load. And so that was an instance where we really had to go full speed ahead in terms of our longer term objective of prioritizing tech debt, because as much as it would have been great to add new features, there would be no point in adding it users wouldn't stick around because the app kept crashing.
What a great example. Jal, over to you. We were talking balancing long and short-term priorities.
Yeah, actually, I have a very contrary example to this. Right? So, we were building a tool or a platform, and we actually over-indexed and prioritized quality and scalability very early on, right? Like knowing that, and honestly, we took that approach that I just told before we shouldn't take, right? Like build it and they will come, right? And we kept building and building and building. And then like there we are, like 9 months later, like we have a really scalable tool. And as we brought users on, they were like, oh, there's this tiny little thing missing here, and I wouldn't use this until you get this done for me, right? And then like you bring in 20 people and they will tell you 25 different things. And now we have invested so much time and effort into building a very scalable solution that nobody is willing to adopt, right? So then we had to actually pause and kind of identify a subset of users that can benefit from this solution, like go get it done, get them onboarded, learn from it before we start to bring other groups of people, other markets and brands in, right? So I think it's a very tricky one, like balancing, especially when it comes to executing to your strategies, balancing short term and long term. And balancing between speed and quality, I think they're really, it's a very tricky subject, right? You'll have to think about your organization's context and what you're trying to achieve, and then find the right balance, I would say.
Yeah, and actually, if you don't mind, I think that kind of segues into one of the questions on Slido over here about how to determine how much time to dedicate on researching and/or analyzing ideas. And I guess why your story made me think of it, you kind of reached to the point where like, we're kind of done, we're ready, but users still needed more. And at that point, you're prioritizing. You probably had other work to do, iterate on the product, et cetera. And now you have all these other incoming requests. I think there's two questions there. There is, how much time do you dedicate to researching? But there's also the practical question of what's your intake process for those kinds of requests? And did you have to create that for your team, or was that something that existed in your company?
Yeah, so it's a mix, right? So I would say in terms of how much time do we dedicate to research, I think I would say a lot. So when I think about, instead of execution, if I think about how do we balance different strategies in your portfolio, one approach I like to apply is like mining existing gold and like finding new gold, right? So mining existing gold is like you have certain opportunities that you've been working on for a while, and you know that if you remove friction in this part of the experience, it's going to have an impact on your conversion or potentially retention of your customer or increase your average order value. So you want to double down on those strategies and keep doing incremental user research and keep mining that existing gold, right? Finding new gold is actually much harder, right? Like new opportunities, you need to really study the market, right? It's not just user research, probably competitive research, market research, right? All of that needs to come in. As a product owner, I think you'll have to balance between both, right? You definitely need to dedicate some time to finding new gold, but also in the short term, you have to dedicate time to mining the existing gold.
Cassidy, over to you on balancing short and long-term priorities.
Yeah, so I manage our enterprise teams at Vimeo, and so our kind of paths to learning are typically they're typically a lot longer than they would be in a kind of consumer-focused industry. So I have to be kind of especially mindful of these because some of our longer term projects, are kind of on the platform side. These are things that can take years, and so it's really important to kind of ensure that you are investing in the right areas and really confident with those things that are going to be very long-term investments. I have a running joke with my other PM friends that the answer to every PM-related question is it depends, but it depends. I think, echoing what both of y'all have already said today, it really is just your level of, confidence in what you are investing in and how much investment is needed in order to kind of validate that confidence. And ideally, ideally you are learning and iterating quickly, and there is no kind of thing that you are, in a hole working on for years and years before it comes out to the light of day and you actually get that feedback and that information. But for balancing work that cannot be sliced any smaller and that has to exist as a large long-term project, I think you already mentioned this, a little bit metaphor of kind of like big rocks followed by small rocks, medium rocks, whatever. Being mindful that, our software teams are comprised of human beings. It's really exhausting to be heads down in a project that takes 6 months, 9 months, a year before you actually see any sort of validation or value. So really being mindful of that and making sure you are, setting up your team, psychically for success and having those kind of quick iterative wins, ideally parallel while you're working on those larger long-term projects.
Yeah. So with an eye to some of the questions popping up here, I had a follow-up of like for those of you with a larger portfolio under you, what challenges specific to that come up in balancing those long-term priorities. But I think one question here is already resonating with the audience around arriving at multi-year roadmaps, especially considering market changes. If you're happy to continue with that, Cassidy.
So we only do a year roadmap. Multi-year is something I would typically not recommend unless, again, you're in a scenario where that makes sense for your business and your market. Our kind of typical sales cycle, a year is plenty. Of course, if you're in kind of medical hardware technology, a 3-year roadmap is going to be normal, and that's what you should be doing. But I would suggest for most software businesses, a 3-year roadmap, once you get past year 1, it's just kind of like, sure, maybe we'll do this. I don't know. This is interesting. What was the question? Just in terms of, how you balance that roadmap, or, yeah. How do you have a multi-year roadmap? Yeah, so I guess the answer is I don't. But I have a 1-year roadmap, and we will on a quarterly basis kind of revisit that. And of course, it becomes less specific as you get further out in time. So short term is very specific, well-researched, validated initiatives. Longer term is hypotheses, questions, things that you want to validate, things that, again, could be interesting.
Right, and I think that's kind of one of the key points there, right? I recently joked with my VP that, looking past year 1 is like, creative writing exercise. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it. That means that, you're going to be at, 50,000 foot level as opposed to 10,000 foot level. So it's not that you can't have goals and aspirations that look out past that first year, but just the level of detail, the level of commitment is obviously going to vary, right? Yeah. Jal, what about yourself?
So very similar, right? Like it's been a while since I wrote a roadmap that's beyond 12 months, honestly, right? But I think one thing that my teams and what we try to do is like, if you are thinking really long term, right? It's a good scenario for you to actually work backwards, right? Like if you have a product vision that is 24 months out or beyond, it's great. Like document the product vision, not necessarily the path to get there, right? Like okay, this is where we want to land, and then in order to get there, what do you want to do in the next quarter, next couple of quarters, and then potentially maybe 6 months after in a less specific manner, right? Yep. Like thinking anything beyond that, a lot of things would change, and I would bet like the product vision that you would document today, saying okay, here is where I want my product to land in 2023 or end of 2023, would look very different if you revisit in 6 months from now or 9 months from now. So.
Sure. Annalika, what about yourself?
I don't think I've ever worked on a roadmap longer than 1 year, echoing what both of you have said. And in the past, it's been much easier to have a clear goal in terms of what I've wanted to accomplish within a year mark. And like you said, sometimes if you revisit it 6 months later, things change. You never know. There are things that will come up that can derail what you planned. I think part of the planning process, whenever you plan ahead, is that you have to account for the fact that unexpected things will come up, and that what you plan to achieve might not necessarily be what you end up achieving.
unexpected changes, reorgs, that one developer leaving, sorry to whoever that talker was. Yes, and that kind of brings me to the last question I had, and then we can kind of focus on some of the remaining Slido questions. What are you doing on a consistent basis to really check in on those priorities, reassess impact, and continually making sure that marriage of the two is what you thought it was last time you did that? Who would like to start? Cassie,
I can
go
start.
ahead.
Yeah. We at Vimeo have tripled in size since I started, which was a year ago this week. So we've been very mindful and very iterative in all of our processes around all of these things. That being said, what we're doing now is I'll start at the micro level and go macro. We, on my teams, I strongly encourage product leaders or managers to do a Monday morning OKR Foursquare, which is effectively looking at your KRs for the quarter and seeing whether you're basically green, yellow, or red. Health metrics, again, whether you're green, yellow, or red. Priorities for the week, and any blockers that the team may have. And that makes sure that OKRs aren't this kind of mystical thing where you check it in 6 months and you're like, oh, what? What was my actual goal here? What am I trying to measure? And also it just kind of ensures, it's a great way to kind of have the team sit down and just sort of, start off the week. We also cap the week with Friday wins or demos, and that's both within our teams and also across all of our product areas. So it's a great way to share out, aside from like release notifications of what the teams are working on, maybe cool new design systems, cool new kind of, parts of our APIs, things like that. From there, we do quarterly OKR planning and review. So we're refreshing them every 6 months, but we're really revisiting them kind of like quarterly just to see, okay, are they still making sense? We have dashboards that kind of real time show those measurements, so we don't have to like report out on that manually, which is nice. And then annually, broader executive will do like a broader kind of OKR review, and then of course starts with, bottoms-up feedback, but then also we need that top-down understanding of mission, vision, and business objectives, because that will help inform your product-level OKRs as well. That's a lot, but I hope that's helpful.
No, absolutely. Jal, on to you.
Yeah, so I think, very similar, right? So like one, periodically actually measuring yourself and, your products and, how your products are doing against your OKRs. Being willing to actually change the OKRs, midway, right?
Yeah.
And they're not set in stone, right? Like, they're written based on your business context at the beginning of the year, right? It might have changed 3 months in, right? The other thing that we try to do is be very reflective and introspective during every planning session or planning season, right? Just to look back and be like, I thought this would happen in my last planning season. Did it transpire exactly how I anticipated it to be? How we anticipated it to be? If not, why? Right? Did we prioritize too many things? Did we, underestimate some challenges that we're going to have? So, and what learnings are we kind of bringing forward from last season to this season?
Great. Annalika.
Yeah, I definitely concur with needing that level of introspection. And I think it also comes back to another theme we've been hearing today, alignment. So in order to ensure that you're working on the most impactful areas as a product leader, you need to make sure that there is alignment across the entire organization in terms of what we should be working on and what we shouldn't be working on. And that means during the planning process, when you're evaluating what you need to be working on, it's making sure that you're asking the critical questions. What are we working on? Is this tied to a big rock? Is this tied to a customer problem? And if it's related to a customer problem, is it something we still need to solve? Do we have research to support the fact that we need to solve it? And does this tie back to the company mission, your quarterly OKRs? And how do you plan to measure success? So you need to continue to drive conversations and alignment. And of course, we also had a conversation about documentation. Make sure you document any decisions and any conversations. So if someone asks questions about why we're working on this versus something else, you can say, we had this planning meeting. We talked about the fact that we had to deprioritize this because we found research that said it's not something we need to solve for right now. It only impacts less than 5% of our audience. And so, like, make sure you have a place where you can point people to if they have questions. And so I think to make sure that you continue to work on the impactful stuff, you have to ask the hard questions. You need to make sure that everyone around you are aligned on what we're doing and why. And of course, document it so it doesn't just exist in your head.
Yeah, so some of those thoughts combined with what Jal was saying, you need to have that flexibility to, if you reassess and things have changed, to change what you're doing, right? And that can mean changing priorities, that can mean changing your OKRs. What kind of do you create a space for your teams to be able to have those conversations, bring that to you? What has worked for you in doing that? Cassidy, you're shaking your head?
Yeah, just generally giving your teams space to have those tough conversations, not only around OKRs, but around any process, things that are working, things that aren't working, and making sure that they feel psychologically safe to, have those, hard conversations of this is, really sucking up my time and not helpful, or this feels counterproductive, or, at the last retro, we feel attacked by the other team that, said our code wasn't as good. Just having the space to kind of have those tough conversations will always be useful. I think specific to, OKRs and strategy, that will typically happen on our kind of Monday morning Foursquare, or, realistically in that kind of quarterly all product review. And it's really helpful to get that feedback of, okay, why are you actually measuring this? Is this actually measuring what you think it's supposed to or going to? You always have to take that trade-off of what is an ideal metric versus what is the best metric we have now, and then working towards that ideal metric. So absolutely supporting your teams to have the space to have those conversations. It will make kind of everything else flow a lot easier.
Would anyone else like to add?
So I think I agree with what Cassidy said. I think it's important to not have a punitive culture, right? One of the phrases that we use amongst our team is you make a decision you try to make it the best possible decision based on the data and information that you have at hand as of today, right? 3 months from now, we all hope we are smarter than what we are and where we are today, right? So you would have more data, you would have more, knowledge and experience. So great if you actually stumbled on the right decision. There is an element of luck involved. It's not that you were great, right? So
yeah.
Just checking in on some of our questions here. Can't read the last one. How do you steer who? I feel like we missed an earlier one around when to, or how do you decide when to impede. I forget what the wording was. You were talking about alignment. Very often, of course, as organizations get larger, people are not necessarily working in silos, but maybe working in their own ways towards the same mission, right? When you do come across those areas where, okay, now we need to change our priorities to maybe help our partner in this other part of the organization, how do you approach those? Cassidy?
I feel like I just nod very vigorously. This all, again, goes back to how strong your company's mission, vision, and, and broader kind of product area OKRs are. I would say I'm very lucky at Vimeo in that everyone I work with, we're all, both leadership team takes the time to make those exceptionally clear and takes feedback on them. But we're all also very comfortable in kind of putting egos aside and saying okay, we have this super cool project that we validated and is well researched, but if we don't help this team kind of get this thing over the finish line, we're all going to fail because we're all working towards the same goals, right? And it really starts with that, having that shared understanding of goals, your mission and vision, kind of 10-year vision, 3-year, shorter term, and then that's kind of where you get to where you can define that within your teams. But if you don't have that shared understanding of what you're working towards across the product groups and across other parts of the business, then of course there's going to be that kind of starvation mentality of no, my stuff first, this is more important. So I would just kind of encourage that.
So I would actually answer in two parts. One is if you have a organization level North Star metric, I think then it's very easy to make these intra team dependency conversations easier. If the other team's project is going to have a huge impact on your North Star metric than what you are working on, then it's natural you should just collaborate and do it, right? But the other part is, if you see these situations arising often, that you have to stop what you're working on to work with somebody else, I would say it's probably time to revisit your org structure, because probably there are too many dependencies amongst teams. Right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a challenging problem, and I mean, I think of Vimeo now, having tripled in size in the past year. The companies experience challenges undergoing that growth that quickly, right? So similarly, if you experience those challenges, it's not unique. Much like Joel was saying, taking that opportunity to reassess: are the teams working on the right things? Are the functions that the teams are supposed to address correct? That would be the time to do that for sure. I see one here to read for our panelists. In risk-averse environments without an established culture of experimentation, how do you get buy-in to prioritize faster iteration and failing quickly?
I can take that. So the last company I worked in was owned by a private equity firm, and there was a lot of risk aversion there. In that it was very hard to get things done and experiment and iterate on things. And so if you said the word experiment or test, there was a visceral reaction to the room. And so I started paying attention in terms of how my stakeholders, what was important to them, and started building those relationships and conversations. And I found out that they really liked the word pilot. And so when they talked about pilots and how they were very much into piloting things, and I said, oh, you know what we should do? We should pilot a new feature and see if this is going to increase registrations. We should pilot having this banner ad show up and see if that will increase newsletter signups. Because at the end of the day, what you want to do is grow the audience, get them coming back to the website and reading content. And so if that's our objective, then we need to be piloting new things to see if we can be successful as a company. And when I started using their language and really coming back to them with the things that I knew they cared about, it changed the equation. So yes, they were risk averse in trying new things, but when you bring it back to, I understand what your objectives are, I understand what you care about in your department, I know as a sales organization you want to bring in more leads and you want to sell more subscriptions, I can help you do that if we pilot this. And so it's about meeting the people where they are, understanding and speaking their language, and that's how you build influence. You have to empathize, and you have to understand that your colleagues are human beings and that their needs matter too.
Yeah, at my old company, we called it a private beta, super double secret beta. I think especially on the enterprise side, you can kind of leverage it as an opportunity for also customer relationship building, right? Let them kind of in under the fold and kind of give you that feedback, and you get that, kind of 1-2 of getting closer with the customer or the prospect, while also getting that feedback early and frequently. Other suggestions I've had for folks in this situation is ultimately, especially in that PE example, quantifying by not, kind of learning quickly and getting these sort of small iterative, kind of pieces into the hands of users, or doing frequent tests, you are actually, losing far more money and value than you are by actually running those things. So I will literally sit down with a giant spreadsheet and just kind of quantify, okay, I have X number of engineers, X number of QA people, and X number of SRE people, and Y number of customer success people, and their hours are worth roughly LMNOP, so that equals this dollar amount. If this fails after 12 months with 0 testing, we're this much in the bucket, versus if we just roll out this little piece in our private beta, then we can actually really minimize that risk. I always suggest, when talking about this specifically and like kind of quantifying risk, Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets is a really kind of nice read if you haven't read it. She's just a bizarre and interesting person, but also it helps kind of tie numbers to risk, which can also, I think, be really helpful for folks that are typically adverse to this sort of format.
Cassidy, you mentioned you do some coaching yourself already. The last question we have time for here, how do you coach your teams through your prioritization models and guide them through the short/midterm projects, but keep them engaged in the long-term vision?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't kind of set prioritization models for my teams. I'm a pretty hands-off manager, so I just make sure they're aware of what sort of different models they can be using, and make sure that what outcomes they're reaching through those models are ideally ultimately driving towards our OKRs. So if I see them really struggling with prioritization or reprioritization or kind of white knuckling what they've prioritized previously, then I'll kind of take another look, but I don't, whatever works for them, as long as it's performing, then I don't really care. In terms of short-term focus versus long-term vision, I think that's where, again, it becomes really important to have that really strong mission and vision and broader product area OKRs versus kind of your team's local OKRs. But also just, again, going back to the small, medium, large rocks, having some of those small wins can really help the team feel energized in some of those short-term projects while also looking at the long-term.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think celebrating, any opportunity to celebrate wins, shared wins, or getting over the end of the quarter, whatever it is,
Yeah.
I think those definitely keep the excitement going. But that engagement in the long-term vision, we can only do so much as product leaders, right? I think rings in Dennis's presentation, if that mission is absent at the top, it kind of makes every mission below that a little more difficult to define, right? Which is not to say you can't do it, but ultimately it needs to be something that speaks to your team, speaks to the business, and that you can get excited about, because you're the one that needs to sell what you're doing, right, every day. So I think balancing that with celebrating the short and midterm wins and developments definitely kind of gets that along. Any other thoughts on the top question there?
I think one thing I would say, is it's always important to have a product vision which is at least a few quarters out, right? So I think that's what I encourage my teams to do. We always try to have a product vision of 2, 3, 4 quarters down the road. Where, what happens with this product? Where do we want to see this? And periodically also, have each of the product leaders share it out with the broader group, so that, because when you have multiple product lines kind of contributing to that vision, it's always important to share that, so that you're not just completely going in tangential directions.
Absolutely. Want to close us out with any other thoughts on?
I echo what both of you have said, and I think in terms of overall, it's really important that, again, there's an alignment on how we prioritize together as a team. Everyone understands what we mean when we say impact. There's an understanding of what we do, why we do it, and I think alignment is key when we want to work together as a team and make sure that we're engaged with the short-term, medium-term, and our longer-term vision.
Well said. Thank you for the questions, audience. And thank you to our panelists.